morning everyone. My name is Dr. Anuj Kumar Singh and I am Assistant Professor in Computer Science and Engineering Department from Kumar Engineering College, Ghaziabad. Today, I am going to discuss a topic from Database Management System, one of the most important topic from Unit 1. The topic name is Database System Architecture. First of all, what is DBMS? DBMS is a general purpose software that can define, construct, manipulate, share and secure the database. So for doing all these purposes, we should understand what is the database system architecture. Without architecture, we cannot understand the working of database management system. So in basic architecture, in DBMS, we follow a 3-tier architecture. There are 3 schemas which we have discussed, that there are 3 schemas. The first, the internal schema, then the logical schema and the external schema. So in this lecture, I will explain how these 3 schemas work and how all these logical works and what is the basic architecture and basic components used in all these 3 schemas. So let's start our topic. So first of all, database system architecture. So as we have discussed that whoever are using the database management system, there are different types of users. So there are 4 types of users generally. The first one is the naive user. So what is naive users? Naive users are the end users. End users means the common man who is using the database through some web applications, web interfaces, application programs, application interfaces. So naive users generally use or interact with the database with the help of application interfaces. Then the second user is application programmer. Application programmer writes the application interfaces or web applications through which the naive user interact with database. So all the web applications of naive users are designed and programmed by application programmer. So application programmer interact with the naive user according to their need and design their interface so that they can interact. The third user is sophisticated user. Sophisticated users uses the database with query tools. They interact with the database with the help of a tools through which they write the queries and directly interact with the database. They do not use application program interface or they do not write. They have a separate query tools and through those tools they interact with the database. And the fourth, the most important user is database administrator, DBA. What DBA do? DBA is responsible for the complete overall designing the overall structure of database. So DBA uses administrative tools through which they can interact with the database. So these are the 4 types of users which interact with the databases. So basically, if we say these are the external schemas through which the user access the database, they just send the request to the database and access the data that is stored in the database. These are the 4 types of users. Now these users have requested the queries in the form of queries or in the form of tools or in the form of commands and ask the data to be accessed from the database. So now the second layer works, the most important logical schema works. In logical schema, there are 2 major components in which all the logical work happen. The first logical component is query processor. The major task of query processor is to deal with the execution of DDL and DML statements. Now the term comes DDL and DML, data definition language and data manipulation language. So what is DDL? What is data definition language? What is data manipulation language? Data definition language deals with the total overall database design, description, structure of database, how we want to access the data. Let's say we take an example. I want to access the student record from a database. So as we know that the end users do not directly interact with the database. They just send the request to the logical schema and from logical schema a request has been sent to the internal schema and data of student is fetched, a copy of that data is stored in logical schema and we access that particular data. So in particular structure the data will be seen to us. So what that structure comes from? That structure comes with the help of DDL statements. DML, data manipulation language. What does DML do? whatever the changes, whatever the manipulation we want to make in our database is done through DML languages only. So whatever tasks we have to do, we have to change, we have to manipulate, we have to update, whatever operations we have to perform on any data that is stored in our database will be deal with the data manipulation language. So query processor generally deals with the execution of DDL and DML statements, whatever the database definition and database manipulation statements do. Query processor has several components. The first component is application program object code. It directly deals with the application interface. So we are sending the end user, the naive user sends the request in the form of high level language or in the form of natural language or in the form of graphical user interface. The machine do not understand that. So there must be a API that converts our high level language into a machine level language. So application program object code is there which converts the high level instructions to the machine level instructions. Similarly, there is a compiler and linker which is associated with application programmer. Application programmer writes the softwares with the help of programming languages. Programming languages are also generally in the high level languages. So we need the translators to convert them into machine level and to link with the library files. The query tools, the sophisticated users generally writes the commands in the form of queries, DML queries, whatever we want to make changes in the database. So all the command statements are generated by DML queries, data manipulation languages, and these DML queries are linked with the compiler, linker and application program object code so that they can be executed. Now last, the component is DDL interpreter. DDL interpreter is data definition language. Data definition language generally interprets the DDL statements into a set of tables containing metadata. Now the term metadata comes. So what is metadata? Metadata is just data about data. Let's say we have a table which have 4 columns. So metadata will be comprising of the information, that is how many columns are there, what type of data types we are using in each column, what are the authority access we have, either we can write or we can only read the data. So all these informations are stored in the metadata. In simple terms, we can say the index of a book is a metadata which contains the complete information about that particular book. So DDL interpreter just interprets DDL statements into a set of tables that contains metadata. Now what does these all things do? They all converts the highest level language into low level language, because all the information that comes from all 4 type of users in a high level language or in the form of natural language. So the basic task of these 4 components is to convert them into low level language so that the query processor understands it and they can execute it. DML compiler, what it do? It translates the DML statements into low level statements. As I had told you that the naive user, sophisticated user or application programmer, they had given the instruction into a high level language. So there should be a translator which can translate statements into low level so that the query evaluation engine can understand and executes the process. The last component, the most important component, is query evaluation engine. What query evaluation engines do? It executes low level instructions that are generated by the commands given from the above users. So this is the complete conceptual schema that a query processor do. This is the one component of conceptual schema. The second component is storage manager. Storage manager deals with the actual low level interfaces and create an interface with the low internal schema and logical schema. Whatever the request the user had sent to logical schema, these requests are passed on to internal schema with the help of storage manager. Storage manager generally process all the provides an interface between the low level and the conceptual level, and whatever the request has been processed from the application programmer in the form of queries. There are several components of app storage manager. The first component is transaction manager. What is a transaction manager? Transaction manager generally deals with all the transactions that we are doing on database management system. What is a transaction? Transaction is the process or the query that is going executed. Transaction will always be either 0% or 100%. Transaction will be completed or it will be rolled back. We cannot left the transaction in between, so that the data become consistent in all the forms. If our database is in consistent state before any transaction, then after that transaction it should be in the consistent state. So this is the duty of transaction manager, to make the database consistent before the transaction and as well as after the transaction. If in case the transaction gets failed, then the transaction manager rollbacks the database into the previous states. So these are the major duties of a transaction manager. The second component is authorization and integrity manager. Authorization and integrity managers are again the important component which checks the authorization of the user, whether the user is authorized to access that particular data or not. A request has been come from any user, whether it is authorized or not, whether the user, whatever the user has requested, it fulfills the constraints or not. Integrity manager checks the integrity constraints. Now the comes what is integrity constraint? Integrity constraint is just the business rules through which we can manage some restrictions on the database. For example, phone number, we should always enter 10-digit mobile number, so it is a constraint. If we have to enter the marks between 0 to 100, so it is a constraint. So these integrity managers check that whether these constraints are fulfilled or not. It checks all the data controls and integrity constraints. Now the third component is file manager. What does file manager do? File manager keeps the track of all the database that is stored in our internal schema. It tracks all the data, in which particular schema it is stored, in which disk it is stored, in which table the data is present. So all the what type of data structure is used, what data types are used. So all these information of allocation of space, all these things are the task of file manager. So file manager generally manage allocation of spaces on disk storage. So all the disk management is done by file manager. We have to compress the data, we have to encrypt the data, whatever the task has to be done in the data files are done generally with file manager. The fourth component is buffer manager. Again an important component. What does buffer manager do? As told earlier, in the end users do not interact with the database directly. They just send the request to the logical schema. Logical schema just check the record in request and pass on to the internal schema. A copy of that particular data is fetched and placed in the logical schema. So where does that particular schema has been stored temporarily? It is stored in the buffer manager. It just fetches the data from the disk storage and it kept in for the temporary memory, so that all the operations can be performed on that particular data. If the user wants to store the updated data, then it will just do the commit command, or this data will be ignored as we turn off the memory system or we turn off the transaction. So buffer manager is also a very important component which keep tracks of the temporary data. So these are the storage manager. Now the third internal schema, disk storage, where the actual data has been stored. In disk storage there are few components. The first is data dictionary. Data dictionary is just the collection of metadata. It stores all the information related to the data. Whatever data has been stored, if there are 4 schemas, then 4 metadata will be there. So all the metadatas are stored in the data dictionary. It just help in quick servicing like searching, sorting. All these operations can be done easily with the help of data dictionary. The second is indexes. Indexes are just used for fast access of data. In let's say if I want to search anything, with the help of indexes I can easily search the data quickly and I can execute that particular data. The third is the actual data which is stored. In the third component, actual data is stored. actual data is stored in data warehouse. So we can call it as data warehouse also. Metadata is stored in data dictionary and actual data is stored in databases or in data warehouses. And the last is the statistical data. What does statistical data do? Statistical data just keeps the track of all the transactions of whatever the user has done. Let's say there is a user 1 who has transacted a query at particular timestamp. So that particular detail of that user and that timestamp and what query he has processed, all the stored information is done in the statistical data. All statistical information about data, title, everything has been stored in the statistical data. So this is the complete database system architecture. So in the brief, I will just explain it in a quick recap that there are three schemas of database management system. First is the external schema through which the end users directly interact with the database. So these are the end schemas, external schemas. So four type of users: just naive users, application programmer, sophisticated user and database administrator. What does they do? They interact with the database. So they do not interact directly with the database, they just process the request, they just send the request to the conceptual schema, logical schema. This comprises of the query processor and storage manager. In query processor, all the high level instructions or high level requests are accepted, they are converted into low level instructions, and they are linked with the library file, and low level instructions code has been generated. These codes are then passed on to the storage manager for further proceedings. Like transaction manager keeps the track record of transaction so that atomicity can be maintained. Atomicity is completing the transaction or roll back the transaction. It should be completed 0% or 100%. Then that request will be authorized, checked that whether the request from an authorized user has come or not. If an authorized user is not demanding that particular request, then data cannot be accessed by that particular user. Integrity manager checks the integrity constraints. File manager, buffer manager do their task. Later on, the request has been passed on to the disk storage internal schema. Now a copy of the internal scheme data has been fetched and stored in the buffer manager where all operations are performed. Whatever the operations we have to perform are done in buffer manager. If the user wants that data, then this data from buffer manager is passed on to the naive users or application programmer with the help of query processor and conceptual schema. So this is the overall database system architecture through which we can process our data. I hope it is clear to everyone. So it is an important topic and we should discuss every component in detail so it is clear to everyone. Thank you.